Mary's earliest memory was not of a lullaby, but of the cold, the deep aching cold of a root cellar, the scent of damp earth thick in her nose. Her mother had shoved her down there, a single finger pressed to her lips, her eyes wide with a fear 10-year-old Mary did not understand. Then the door had closed, plunging her into blackness. The sounds that followed were not loud, but they were terrible. The thud of a body hitting the floorboards above, a man's low, cruel laugh, the jingle of spurs moving through the small house, taking everything of value. She stayed there for hours, until the silence was heavier than the noise. When she finally pushed the door open, the first thing she saw was her mother's hand, palm up on the kitchen floor, and the dusty shaft of moonlight that made her wedding band gleam. That was the night Mary Matthews died, and a lifetime of running began. Years later, in the quiet town of Covenant, that memory was a ghost she kept locked away. She was Mary Rivers now, wife to preacher Elias. Her life was defined by the soft murmur of prayers, the scent of sun-baked wood in the church, and the profound peace of her husband's love. Elias was a tall, quiet man whose strength was in his gentleness. He had found her working in a dusty diner in another life, a silent girl with shadows in her eyes, and he had offered her not pity, but a future. Covenant was their sanctuary, a small town nestled in a wide valley, where the biggest troubles were a broken fence or a lack of rain. She believed that past was buried. She was wrong. She first saw him from the porch of the church, shaking out a rug. The sun was high and a haze of heat shimmered over the main street. A rider was coming in from the east, moving at a slow, deliberate walk. There was nothing unusual about a stranger, but something in the way he sat his horse, a relaxed arrogance, made her hands still. As he drew closer, details resolved through the glare. A black duster coat despite the heat, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a dark beard covering the lower half of his face. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a posture, a silhouette she had spent a decade trying to forget. He reined in his horse right in the middle of the street, as if he owned the very dust beneath its hooves. His head turned slowly, scanning the buildings until his gaze landed on her. Even from 50 feet away, she felt the impact. He didn't smile. He just looked. Then he tipped his hat, a mockery of courtesy, and nudged his horse toward the saloon. The rug slipped from Mary's numb fingers. The world seemed to tilt, the familiar sights of Covenant twisting into something strange and threatening. The air felt too thick to breathe. Elias found her there a few minutes later, her face pale. "Mary, are you unwell, my dear?" he asked, his voice full of warm concern. He placed a hand on her forehead. She flinched at his touch, something she had never done before. I'm fine," she stammered, forcing a smile that felt like a crack in glass. "Just the heat." "It surprised me." Elias looked doubtful, but he nodded. "Come inside. Rest. I have to visit old Mr. Higgins, but I won't be long." He kissed her cheek, his love a painful contrast to the ice forming in her veins. She watched him walk away, his Bible in his hand, his faith a shield he didn't know he would need. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of dread. Every sound from the street made her jump. She tried to busy herself with chores, but her hands were trembling so badly she could barely hold a plate. She told herself she was being foolish. It couldn't be him. That man was a ghost from a nightmare thousands of miles away. It was just a coincidence, a trick of the light and her own haunted mind. She needed to see. She needed proof that it wasn't him. Late in the afternoon, she gathered her basket and told herself she was going to the general store for supplies. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs as she stepped out into the street. The town was quiet, sleepy. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning the boardwalks, the doorways of the saloon. And then she saw him. He was leaning against a post outside the bar, whittling a piece of wood with a long, sharp knife. He had removed his hat. The face was older, harder, the beard covering cheeks that were now lean and weathered. But the eyes were the same, cold, pale blue like chips of winter ice. They looked up and met hers as if he had been waiting for her. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face, revealing a familiar gap between his front teeth. It was him, Silas Rourke, the man from the root cellar, the man who had murdered her mother. The basket fell from her hand, scattering potatoes and cloth in the dirt. She stood frozen, trapped in that gaze from her childhood. He pushed himself off the post and took a few steps toward her. not closing the entire distance, just enough to be heard. His voice was a low, gravelly thing that scraped against her soul. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his smile never fading. "Little Mary Matthews, all grown up and prettier than a picture." He looked her up and down, a predator sizing up his prey. "Heard you'd made something of yourself. Found religion. Married the preacher." Mary could not speak. Her throat was sealed shut by pure terror. Silas took another step, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried through the still air. "That's a mighty fine life you built for yourself here. Real peaceful." He paused, letting the threat hang in the silence between them. "Be a real shame if someone was to disrupt it?" He glanced toward the church, then back at her, his eyes boring into hers. "You remember how I disrupt things, don't you, girl?" Mary found a shred of strength, a tiny ember of the rage that had sustained her for years. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Silas's smile vanished. "I want what's mine. You hid from me for a long time, but you can't hide from your blood. Your mama owed a debt. You're gonna settle it." He took a final step, so close now she could smell the tobacco and whiskey on him. "You tell your preacher man nothing. You meet me back here tomorrow noon with every cent you have in that church collection box, or I'll pay a visit to that fine house of yours, and I'll have a long talk with your husband about the sin of lying, and the price for it." He turned and walked back into the saloon, leaving her standing in the street surrounded by her scattered groceries. The world came rushing back in a wave of sound, the chirp of a bird, the distant low of a cow, but it all felt distant and wrong. The monster was back. He had not come for her past. He had come for her future. He had come for Elias. She mechanically picked up her basket and the spilled items, her movements robotic. Her mind was screaming, cycling through impossible options. She could tell Elias, but what would her gentle, godly man do? He would confront Silas, and Silas would kill him without a second thought. She could run, but Silas would hunt her, and he would punish Elias for her escape. She could pay, but she knew a man like Silas would never be satisfied. He would bleed them dry and then burn what was left for sport. There was no way out. She walked back to the empty church, her sanctuary now feeling like a gilded cage. She stood at the pulpit where Elias spoke of forgiveness and grace, and all she could feel was a cold, hardening certainty. She would not let Silas Rourke destroy this man. She would not let him poison this peace. She would do whatever it took to protect the life they had built. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery oranges and reds, Mary Rivers made a decision that would forever sever her from the woman she had tried to become. She walked to the small closet in the back of the church, the one where they stored donated goods for the poor. Her hand did not shake as she reached into a box of old clothes and felt beneath them. Her fingers closed around the cold, hard metal of the thing she had carried with her through all those years of running, the thing she had sworn to Elias she would never need again. She pulled out the small, single-action revolver. It was heavy in her hand, a dreadful weight of finality. She stood there in the fading light, the weapon held at her side, and stared out the window at the town she loved. Somewhere out there a monster waited, and she knew with a soul-deep certainty that only a monster could kill another. The gentle preacher's wife was gone. The setting sun cast her long shadow against the wall, a dark and solitary figure holding a terrible secret, waiting for her husband to come home. The gun felt like a frozen snake coiled in the box of donated clothes. Mary's fingers brushed against it again, and a jolt of revulsion shot through her arm. She slammed the closet door shut, her heart hammering. She couldn't. It was an impossible thought. Elias's voice echoed in her memory, gentle but firm. "We are people of the book, Mary, not the bullet. Violence is a language God does not speak." She walked into the main hall of the church, her eyes drawn to the simple cross on the wall. She fell to her knees at a pew, gripping the worn wood until her knuckles turned white. She prayed for the first time since she'd seen Silas. She prayed for a miracle. She prayed for strength to tell Elias the truth. The church door creaked open and Elias walked in, his footsteps quiet on the plank floor. "Mary?" His voice was soft. He saw her kneeling, her face pale and streaked with tears. He was at her side in an instant, his large hand warm on her shoulder. "My dear, what is it?" "You've been troubled all day." This was her moment. She could tell him. She could pour out the whole horrible story of her past and let this good, strong man share the burden. She opened her mouth, the words trembling on her lips, but then she looked into his eyes. They were full of kindness and a faith so pure it was almost fragile. She saw the man who believed in redemption for every soul, even the worst. He would try to reason with Silas. He would offer forgiveness instead of a fight. And Silas would laugh, and then he would put a bullet in Elias's heart without a second thought. The truth would get her husband killed. She forced a weak smile. It is nothing. A foolish headache. The heat, I think. She placed her hand over his. I am just tired. Elias looked unconvinced, but he nodded. Let me get you some water. As he walked toward their living quarters, Mary's brief courage shattered. Telling him was not an option. The risk was too great. She was alone with this. The night was endless. Mary lay beside Elias, listening to his steady, trusting breathing. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Silas's cold smile. She heard his threat. I'll have a long talk with your husband about the sin of lying. The image of Elias, confused and heartbroken. Learning about her buried past from that monster's lips was more than she could bear. A plan began to form in her mind, desperate and terrible. It was the only way. She would meet Silas. She would take the money from the small strong box where they kept the church donations. It wasn't much, but maybe it would be enough to make him leave. If it wasn't, her thoughts drifted again to the cold weight of the gun. She would cross that bridge if she came to it. The next morning, she moved through her chores like a ghost. Elias mentioned going to check on a sick family at the far end of the valley after lunch. He would be gone for hours. It was a sign. It was her only chance. Her hands were steady as she packed a small canteen of water. They were steady as she lifted the floorboard under their bed and took out the strong box, removing the few bills and coins inside. They were steady as she folded the money into a cloth pouch. But when she walked back to the donation closet, her breath hitched. She reached into the box, her fingers searching. They closed around the rough, checkered grip of the revolver. She pulled it out. It was older, a .31 caliber pocket pistol, its bluing worn away in places. Her mother's gun. The one she had been too terrified to use all those years ago. She loaded it with 5 bullets from a small, dusty box, her movements mechanical. The 6th chamber she left empty, under the hammer, just as she'd been taught. A safety measure for a weapon that had none. She hid the gun and the money in a deep pocket of her apron. She kissed Elias goodbye when he left, holding his face in her hands for a moment longer than usual, memorizing the feel of his skin. She watched him ride away until he was a speck on the horizon, and a part of her wished she was riding with him, leaving this terrible choice behind. Noon came. The town was quiet, lost in the heat of the day. Mary walked toward the saloon, her feet heavy. Silas was there, as promised, leaning in the shade of the building. He saw her and pushed himself upright, that same vile smile on his face. He didn't speak, just jerked his head toward the northern end of town, toward the box canyon where nobody went. She followed him, her heart pounding so hard she felt dizzy. They walked in silence for 10 minutes, leaving the safety of the town behind. The canyon walls rose around them, dusty and red. It was a dead end, a perfect isolated place for a crime. He stopped and turned to face her. All right, girl. Let's have it. She pulled the pouch from her pocket and threw it at his feet. He picked it up, loosened the drawstring, and peered inside. His smile vanished. He snorted in disgust. This is it? This ain't nothing. You think this pays your debt? It's all we have, Mary said, her voice barely a whisper. Then you'll get more, Silas said, taking a step toward her. You'll empty that collection plate every week. You'll steal from your pious husband if you have to. I own you now, Mary, just like I owned your mama. He took another step. He was close now. But first, I think I'll take a down payment of a different kind. His eyes roamed over her body, and his meaning was horrifyingly clear. The past was not just repeating itself, it was going to be worse. Mary took a step back, her hand slipping into her apron pocket. Her fingers closed around the pistol grip. Fear threatened to paralyze her. Silas saw the movement and laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. What you got in there, girl? A knitting needle? He reached for her. In that moment, Mary didn't think. A raw animal instinct took over. She yanked the gun from her pocket, her thumb pulling back the hammer as she raised it. The click was loud in the silent canyon. Silas's eyes went wide with genuine surprise, which then twisted into fury. "You little—" He moved fast, his hand darting for the gun at his own hip. Mary didn't aim. She shut her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was immense, a deafening crack that echoed off the canyon walls. The gun kicked in her hand, a painful, jarring shock. She opened her eyes. Silas was staring at her, his expression one of pure astonishment. A dark red stain was spreading rapidly across the front of his shirt. He looked down at it, then back up at her, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His gun was only half out of its holster. He took one stumbling step backward. Then his legs gave way and he crumpled to the ground. He lay on his side, his breath coming in wet, ragged gasps. Mary stood frozen, the gun still smoking in her hand. The world had shrunk to this patch of dust, the smell of burnt gunpowder, and the terrible sound of a dying man. Silas's gasps grew slower, farther apart. Then they stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, ringing silence that pressed in on her from all sides. It was done. She had done it. Mary walked forward on legs that felt like water. She stood over him, looking down at the man who had haunted her life. The pale blue eyes were open, but they saw nothing. The cruel smile was gone forever. There was no triumph in this moment, only a vast hollow emptiness. She had killed a man. She had broken her vow to Elias. She had broken her own soul. She dropped the gun in the dust beside him as if it were a live coal. Her hands were trembling violently now. She turned and ran from the canyon, stumbling over rocks in her panic. She had to get back. She had to be home before Elias. She had to pretend that nothing had happened. She burst out of the canyon mouth and forced herself to slow to a walk as she neared the town. She kept her head down, avoiding the eyes of the few people on the street. She reached the church and practically fell through the door, leaning against it to catch her breath. The familiar scent of wax and wood surrounded her. It smelled of peace. It smelled of a life she had just defiled. She rushed to the wash basin and scrubbed her hands over and over, but she couldn't get the smell of gunpowder off her skin. She changed her dress, bundling the old one into the bottom of the laundry basket, hiding the evidence of her sin. She was sitting in a pew, trying to look calm, when Elias returned. He came in smiling, his face sun-warmed and kind. "The Miller boy is feeling much better," he said, his voice filling the quiet space. He walked over to her and bent down to kiss her forehead. He paused. He leaned in closer and his smile faded. His kind eyes searched hers, seeing the tremor she couldn't control. "My dear," he said, his voice soft with confusion. "What is that smell?" "It smells like—" "Sulfur." Mary's blood ran cold. She looked up into the face of the man she had done this for, the man she loved more than anything, and she saw the first flicker of a doubt she would spend the rest of her life trying to erase. The days after the gunshot were a waking nightmare for Mary. She moved through her life like a puppet, her body performing tasks while her mind was trapped in that dusty canyon. She scrubbed the church floor until her knees were raw, trying to scour away the memory. She cooked meals she could not eat. She smiled at Elias with lips that felt like they were made of clay. Every word from his mouth was a fresh torture. When he spoke of God's grace, she thought of the finality of a bullet. When he preached on the sanctity of life, she saw Silas's astonished eyes. She was living a lie in the house of truth, and the hypocrisy was a poison in her veins. Elias noticed the change in her, of course. How could he not? The vibrant, gentle woman he married had been replaced by a nervous, hollowed-out ghost. She jumped at the sound of a slamming door. She couldn't meet his gaze for more than a second. Her hand, when he held it, was cold and limp. He told himself it was the shock of the violence in their peaceful town. He tried to comfort her, to pull her close, but she would stiffen in his arms. A subtle recoil that felt like a rejection. The warmth that had always flowed between them was gone, replaced by a chilling distance he did not understand. The town was abuzz with the news. A man's body had been found in the box canyon, shot dead. Sheriff Cobb had identified him as a known troublemaker from a neighboring territory, a man named Silas Rourke. The official story was a gambler's dispute gone bad. But the news sent a new wave of terror through Mary. They knew his name. His name was out in the world now, a thread that someone someday might pull. Elias came home from the sheriff's office, his face grim. "They say he was a bad man, Mary, a very bad man. The world might be better off." He said it to comfort her, to ease the fear he saw in her eyes about the violence so close to home. But his words had the opposite effect. Mary turned away, a strangled sound catching in her throat. The idea that Elias, her good and righteous husband, could ever think the world was better for her sin made her feel violently ill. Her reaction was too sharp, too personal. Elias watched her, a tiny dark seed of doubt planting itself in his mind. Why would the death of a stranger affect her so deeply? Later that evening, Mary was frantically gathering the laundry, wanting to burn the dress she had worn that day, to destroy any last particle of evidence. In her rush, she overturned the mending basket. Spools of thread, buttons, and a small wooden box clattered across the floor. Elias knelt to help her pick everything up. His fingers closed around the small box. It was old, intricately carved. He had never seen it before. "What's this?" he asked, opening the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a tarnished silver locket. Mary froze, her blood running cold. She had kept it hidden for years. A secret piece of her past she could not bear to part with. "It's nothing," she said, her voice too high. "Just an old trinket." But Elias was already prying the stiff locket open. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. A smile that was now etched permanently on Mary's face. And on the other side, a small, carefully inscribed name, Lillian Matthews, Mary's mother. Elias looked from the photograph to Mary's horrified face. The last name was different. Matthews, not Rivers. A name from a life before him she had never mentioned. "Mary?" he asked, his voice soft but full of confusion. "Who is this?" Panic seized her. The lie came tumbling out, clumsy and rushed. She was a friend. From a long time ago. She gave it to me before she passed. She reached for the locket, but Elias held it, his eyes fixed on hers. He saw the sheer terror in her expression. It was not the look of someone remembering a lost friend. It was the look of someone caught in a lie. "Matthews," he said slowly. "Mary, was that your name?" The question hung in the air. It was a door she had sworn never to open. But the door was now cracked and the ghosts were rushing out. She couldn't form the words. Her silence was all the answer he needed. The doubt in his mind grew, twisting and turning. A different name, a hidden past, a reaction to a stranger's death that was too personal, too raw. And then he remembered the first thing she had said when he told her about the body in the canyon. Her words echoed in his memory. She hadn't asked who was he, or what happened. Her first terrified question had been, where did they find him? As if she already knew who it was, as if she already knew he was dead. The pieces, jagged and horrifying, began to click together in his mind. The missing money from the collection box he'd dismissed as a mistake in his ledger. The smell of gunpowder on her that afternoon. Her profound, debilitating fear. Her different name. Her connection to a dead man. The truth crashed over Elias like a cold wave, so terrible he physically staggered back a step. He looked at his wife, truly looked at her, and for the first time he saw a stranger. He saw a woman carrying a secret so dark it was eating her alive. The foundation of their entire marriage, built on trust and faith, splintered beneath his feet. His voice was a whisper, raw with a pain he had never known was possible. "Mary," he said. "The man in the canyon. Silas Rourke. Did you know him?" Mary wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold her breaking pieces together. She could not speak. She could not confirm his nightmare, but she could not deny it either. Her silence was a confession. Elias's face crumpled. The love in his eyes warred with a dawning horror. The man who preached forgiveness every Sunday was now staring into the face of a sin he could not name, committed by the woman he loved. The gentle preacher was gone, replaced by a husband whose heart was shattering. He slowly placed the locket back in its box and set it on the table between them, as if it were a loaded gun. He looked at her one last time, his expression a tortured mix of love, betrayal, and utter confusion. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the house into the cooling evening air, leaving her alone with the crushing weight of what he now knew. Mary stood alone in the quiet room, the space between her and the door feeling like an uncrossable canyon. The truth was out. Not all of it, but enough. Elias knew she had lied about everything. He knew she was connected to a dead man. The fragile world she had tried to rebuild lay in pieces at her feet. She had saved him from Silas Rourke only to destroy him herself. She waited for him to return, her heart pounding with a terrible final fear. She waited for the sound of his footsteps, for the door to open, for the judgment that would finally end this agony. She knew that when he came back, nothing between them would ever be the same again. The waiting was the worst punishment of all. The silence in the little church had become a physical presence, a third person in the room with them. It had been 3 days since the discovery of Silas Rourke's body in the canyon, and the town of Covenant was buzzing with a nervous, fearful energy. A stranger dead by violence. Sheriff Cobb had asked his questions, but he was a simple man who believed in simple answers. He concluded it was a falling out among thieves, that the man had gotten what he deserved. The town was eager to agree and move on, but Elias could not move on. He had withdrawn into a quiet, contemplative shell. He had not asked Mary again about the smell of gunpowder, but the question hung between them, a ghost at their table. He watched her now as she tried to mend a shirt, her hands shaking so badly she kept pricking her finger. She was a shadow of the woman he married, her eyes hollow, jumping at every sound. He saw the terror in her, and a cold dread settled in his own stomach. He had been trying to pray, to find guidance in his Bible, but the words seemed empty. His faith, once a clear and steady path, now felt like a dense fog. He loved his wife with every fiber of his being, but a terrible suspicion was taking root in his heart, a weed he could not pull. He stood up from his desk, the movement sudden. Mary flinched, dropping the sewing into her lap. Elias walked to the donation closet and opened the door. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that he had to look. He moved the box of old clothes. His eyes fell on the small empty space where something had once been, and then he saw it, partly hidden behind a sack of flour. A small cardboard box. He picked it up. It was light. He opened it. Inside were 5 identical, unused .31 caliber bullets, the exact caliber of the bullet that had killed Silas Rourke. The box fell from his numb fingers, scattering the bullets on the floor with a series of soft metallic clicks. Mary was standing in the doorway, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She had seen what he found. There was no more hiding. The evidence was literally at his feet. Elias turned to face her, and the pain in his eyes was more than she could bear. "Mary," he said, his voice a broken thing, "tell me it is not true. Tell me you had nothing to do with this." It was the plea of a man clinging to the edge of a cliff. Mary opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She wanted to lie, to protect him from the awful truth, to protect the last shred of his image of her. But she was so tired. The weight of the secret was crushing her. She looked at the man she loved, his world breaking apart because of her, and she knew she owed him the truth, no matter how much it destroyed them. The dam inside her burst. A sob wrenched itself from her throat, and the words began to pour out, a torrent of agony and confession. She told him everything. She started with the root cellar, with her mother's hand, with the cold and the fear. She told him about Silas Rourke, the monster of her childhood. She told him about the threat, the demand for money, the vile promise of what he would do to her and then to Elias. She spoke of her desperation, her feeling of being trapped with no way out. Her voice was raw, cracking under the weight of the memory. She told him about taking the gun, her mother's gun, about walking to the canyon. She described the moment Silas reached for her, the explosion, the silence that followed. She did not ask for forgiveness. She only stated the facts, her hands clutched to her chest as if holding her own heart together. When she finished, she collapsed into a pew, her body racked with silent, heaving sobs. She had given him every terrible piece of the truth. She had handed him the weapons to condemn her utterly. Elias stood perfectly still. He listened to it all without a word, without a movement. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. Inside, his soul was in turmoil. The world he knew, of right and wrong, of sin and redemption, of the gentle wife he adored, had been obliterated. The image of his Mary holding a gun, pulling the trigger. It was incompatible with everything he believed. His preacher's mind recoiled. Murder was a sin, a mortal sin. It was a line that was not to be crossed. The law of man and the law of God were clear. He should be horrified. He should turn away. He should call for the sheriff. But as he looked at her, crumpled and broken, he did not see a murderer. He saw a terrified girl who had been running her whole life. He saw a woman who had been backed into a corner with no escape. He saw the love that had driven her to it. A fierce, desperate, wrong-headed love to protect him. He thought of the monster she described, and a cold, unchristian anger stirred in his own heart. He knew, with a certainty that shook him, that if he had been in that canyon, if that man had threatened his Mary, he might have done the very same thing. His faith had always been about love. Love for his fellow man. Love for God. And now he was facing the ultimate test of that faith. Could he love her through this? Could he condemn the sin but not the sinner who was his own heart? The silence stretched thin and terrible. Mary waited for his judgment, for the rejection she knew she deserved. Elias took a slow, deep breath. He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing in the quiet church. He did not stop until he was standing right before her. He slowly knelt down on the floor in front of her, so that his eyes were level with hers. His own eyes were filled with tears. "Look at me, Mary," he whispered. She forced herself to raise her head to meet his gaze, expecting to see revulsion. She saw only a profound, heartbreaking sorrow. "You should have told me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We should have faced him together. That was my failure. I made you feel you could not come to me." This was not the reaction she had prepared for. This was grace, and it was more painful than any punishment. "Elias, I killed a man," she wept. "I know what I am. I know what you did," Elias corrected her gently. He reached out and took her cold, trembling hands in his own. "But I also know why you did it. And I will not condemn a heart that was trying to protect its own." He was not speaking as Preacher Elias now. He was speaking as her husband. The title of preacher felt like a distant, ill-fitting coat. This was a matter of the heart, not the pulpit. "The world will see a sin," he said. "But I see the woman I love, who carried a burden no person should ever have to carry. We will bear this together now." It was his choice. The twist in his soul, the decision to choose love over law, mercy over judgment. He was choosing her. Mary stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. The forgiveness she had not dared to hope for was being offered, and it was a balm and a torment all at once. She had not been forsaken. He pulled her into his arms, and she buried her face in his shoulder, weeping for all that was lost and all that was somehow, miraculously, still there. They held each other for a long time in the quiet church, two broken people clinging to the one thing the violence and the lies had not been able to destroy. The path ahead was uncertain. They would have to live with this secret forever. The memory of the gunshot would always echo in the quiet moments, but they would not have to live with it alone. Later that evening, Elias stood and walked to the church doors. He opened them and looked out at the sunset painting the sky. Mary came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. They did not speak. There were no words adequate for the journey ahead. They would leave Covenant. This town was no longer a sanctuary. It was a museum of their pain. They would go west, somewhere new, where the past could not find them. They walked out of the church together, leaving the altar and the pews behind them. They were no longer just a preacher and his wife. They were two people bound by a love that had been tested in the fiercest of fires. A love that had seen the worst and had chosen, against all odds, to remain. The future was a blank page, and they would write it together, one scarred, tentative step at a time.